Alright, now, before anything else, for those of you who might be watching this, welcome, welcome, thank you for tuning in. I've gotten a lot of requests for doing this, and I'm testing something out really in a non-serious manner, but we're just gonna see what happens. And I am filming this at the same time, because everyone wants to see it filmed, so we're just gonna see what happens. But we're just gonna pretend that there is no camera, and we're just gonna do the show as usual. And this is kind of like a test. That's all that there is to it. So, first things first. In the last program, I was asking a question to the audience, and I was asking for some responses to see what would come in for this program, and from there, we would just read them out, see what perspectives, and so on we got. Now, the question asked last week was really in regards to perspective, kind of a glass half empty, glass full perspective, optimism versus pessimism. And it was essentially saying, it was a philosophical question. Someone was criticizing it. They were saying, "What's the point? It's not realistic. Why bother?" But that's really the whole thing about a lot of philosophical questions, points, and arguments, is that they are not necessarily supposed to be realistic. It's that outside the box type of thinking that is an extremely important thing. So that's what it was about. And it was essentially asking, if everyone started focusing on the bright side of things, was not looking at what was wrong with the world and society, but was instead looking at what is going right and what is going well, and everyone had this uh, glass half full outlook, would humanity be better off, or would it be worse off? How would we be? So that's what I wanted to see. Now, my answer to that, because I answered it last week, I was saying, well, I think it's all about a balance. I think it's important to be able to look on the bright side of things, but at the same time, you need to know what is going wrong in order to have a so called reality check, so that if there are issues, you could possibly be able to pinpoint them, address them, and remedy them at that. So anyway, we had a lot of good responses I want to get to. It always is amazing, though, that sometimes we just can't agree to disagree. Where sometimes I get some responses if someone disagrees with what I had to say. Oh, they'll be so vulgar and rude, and no one can act civilized. But the PG, to an extent, responses, we got a few of them here, and let's just get to them. So first, answering this is Zach in Charlotte, North Carolina, I believe. He says, I would say that focusing on the positive would allow us to advance at a much quicker pace. I do not think we need to block out the negative things occurring in our lives completely, but simply place our focus on the positive situations in order to move forward in life. Focusing on negativity will breed more negativity and most likely bring you down. From personal experience, focusing on the negatives keeps you stuck, does not allow you to grow. Focusing on positive thoughts, goals, and ideals will allow us to progress further and grow into better people. Accomplishing small things and staying focused on positives will no doubt help our society move towards a brighter future. Thank you, Zach. That's kind of getting into what I was mentioning last week, where yes, there needs to be that balance, like you said. And I also agree with your point where you were saying, in regards to negativity, it breeds upon itself. Negativity, it spirals down. It's a real, true downward spiral. It breeds on itself, it focuses, and, one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next, and it spirals down. Thank you for your perspective, Zach. Going over to Aiden, writes the following. My opinion is that it would be overall better. To elaborate, depression has often looked at, my apologies, he says, to elaborate, depression has been often looked at as a truer look on the world. Without sunshine and happiness, it's easier to see the problems. But looking at these problems, where not all of them are possible to fix, I believe is the crux of where the depression stems from. My first thought was that the population that is receiving help would no longer receive it due to people no longer paying attention to them. But as I contemplated more, I began to realize that the vast majority of people need help because of their focus on the bad things. If everyone focused on the good, then people would be more happy and in turn more happy to help and more content to be around other people without the social anxieties and thoughts of what could go wrong. So the ones that currently need help but don't have it could receive it due to a more comfortable atmosphere. And not just in the US, he says, but worldwide, there would be a more positive outlook and ultimately change for the better. Very interesting point, Aiden. That's something that I never even thought of that. Where it is absolutely possible that if theoretically everyone started having a positive outlook, then people may be more inclined to assist those in need. That's interesting. Nowadays, of course, when it comes down to charity and assisting other people, it's kind of like, it is what it is. Anyone but me is going to go in and step in and help them out. So it's an interesting thing. Maybe if people were looking on the bright side, maybe there would be people that would be more inclined to help. There's also, of course, a chance that it could possibly breed selfishness. But who's to say? You could also have it where everyone will be, well, everything's going good for me, and it would just be that self-centric viewpoint. But of course, this is all hypothetical. We cannot test that out. Next viewpoint is from Sawyer. In my opinion, the art of complaining or focusing on negative thoughts in a situation leads to a type of progress. Now, I understand it is important to have positive outlooks on life to keep your emotional stability in check. However, without any negative situations to focus on, I feel as if life would become almost stagnant in terms of human progress, so to say. Thank you, Sawyer, for your viewpoint. And that is interesting that you mentioned that you say, well, without anything negative to focus on, how could things get done? That's an interesting point of view. Thank you for writing in, Sawyer. Next viewpoint comes from Matt in New South Wales, Australia. As to your question regarding optimism and pessimism, I largely agree with the viewpoint. However, I would go as far as to say that focusing on what is going wrong is more important than focusing on what is going well. Now, that's not to say that focusing on what is going well is unimportant, but innovation comes from being dissatisfied with how things are. Looking at how things are doing poorly presents us with opportunities. If you are unhappy with the performance on an exam, for example, you are presented with an opportunity to better your knowledge and understanding. They say that failure is the best teacher, and that is absolutely true. If nothing could be improved on in the world, then we would all stagnate. It's important to have optimism and to acknowledge when things are going well, but being dissatisfied with how things are going is how we progress. Now, see, that's an interesting point, Matt, because, like you said, that's an interesting example, too. If you do bad on an exam, that may very well serve as a source of motivation to say, okay, I screwed up, I messed up, and I can see where I failed, where that fault was, what happened, what went wrong. And from there, if I'm serious about doing better, if I'm serious about improving and, just making things better going forward, I can look at where I went wrong, I could hone in on that, and I can take that, work on it, and then the next time around, do a better job. Now, of course, that is with the assumption that everyone has a work ethic, that people are willing to care and say, well, all right, this is where things went wrong, this was the issue, and we can fix it. Sometimes you'll have people that have this complacency and they'll say, I don't care, and that's where that stands. But like I said, I still remain steadfast in the standpoint, the viewpoint, best way to put it, that there needs to be the balance. Like I said, it's important to look on the bright side of things, to have that glass half full outlook, to have an optimistic attitude, but at the same time to be grounded as well, not to just be completely up there in cloud nine. And like you said, if there are issues, especially serious ones, They need to be addressed and not brushed off to the side in complacency. Janet in South Carolina is checking in next. She says, always look on the bright side of life. You can maintain a positive outlook while dealing with all the relentless travails of everyday life. I'm a very optimistic pessimist. Even when feeling down, try to approach everything with positivity instead of focusing on the negative. It certainly does not mean being happy all the time. I've had rare glimpses of that elusive beast, happiness, but when it leaves me, I still have an underlying current of hope. Thank you for your 2 cents and your viewpoint. I think it is interesting where by these responses you are seeing an interesting trend in the answers that are coming in, where you have lots of people that kind of have the same viewpoint, and I think it's a very reasoned one, to the extent that there needs to be that balance. It's okay to be positive. It's okay to have that positivity, but not necessarily to have one that is greatly more than the other to the point where one cancels the other out. I think it all is about that balance. Let's see who else we have. Chris, Eastern Kentucky. He says, well, I wonder, is the entire planet looking towards the positive aspects instead of the negative? If we were to only focus on the positive, would there be anything negative? Or would people instead change their entire mindsets to see everything as positive? Would we look at terrible events as a lesson? Or would we look at things as it is destined to happen? Now take the 1950s, for example. A lot of people today always proclaim that those were the perfect times, always wishing we can go back. Like there were no problems, just the golden time to be around. But people disregard the fact that the Korean War was in place, segregation was still a major issue, and women were not accepted to speak their minds. If we keep our eyes on the good things, then it seems that progression into the future for humanity will decrease. I know he says, I am a young constitutional conservative. I believe that relying on only the positives just keeps the negativity in a pause. A push back toward finding the solutions to our problems. I do believe a lot of people out there focus too much on what is bad in the world. News networks today never have anything positive to say about anyone. It's just a gossip trend. So personally, I believe there should be an equal mend on both parts, an eye for the good and an eye for the bad. Yes, the news cycle always, unfortunately, and this is just how it is, the news cycle feeds and thrives off of negativity. That's just the way that it is. It's the way that it goes, unfortunately, because everyone likes to hear those bad stories. Everyone likes to hear, I shouldn't say everyone, but of course a sizable majority of people like to hear about who got shot, who got killed, what happened at this robbery here and there, and the other thing. But of course, I think that ties down into human nature. Another interesting thing that you did mention in your comment was kind of in the hypothetical time machine, where you do see a lot of people that say, oh, I wish I could go back to the 1950s or the 40s, or, insert time several decades ago. And I think everyone looks at the positive traits from that era and kind of forgets about the negatives. One thing that always kind of makes me laugh is sometimes you'll get people who, see the way people dressed back then, see, how things looked, and they'll say, oh, yeah, I wish I could go back to the 1940s and 50s and so on. And I just think that some people may have this idea that things were really better back then. A lot of people forget the very simple thing that the internet didn't exist back then. I think so many of us without the internet or smartphones would just go stir crazy. Look, I'll be completely honest myself. I use the internet all the time. And while I enjoy getting things from other medias, I enjoy listening to the radio, I enjoy reading. Of course, if the internet permanently went away, of course I would be clawing up the walls, and I would be, I think so many of us at this point have this dependency on the internet that we just kind of forget about because it's always there. We have a couple more answers coming in. Michael M., to answer your question finally, I certainly believe that a shift towards thinking the glass is half full would have positive effects for our world. Much crime, dereliction, and generally antisocial behavior, I believe, stems from a mental space where few, if any, options appear to be open, where the cloud of negativity obscures the future and chokes out high quality, pro social routes of behavior. As you say yourself, negative emotions have a fundamentally different character than do positive ones. While I don't deny negativity has its place, and it certainly does, all of my knowledge and personal experience suggests that a bomb against it would be far from a miss. Thank you for your perspective, Michael M. Always interesting to read. And let's check the time right here. We have enough time to get to two more responses. Courtney in England, in response to your question asking if things would get better or worse if we focused on what good things we have rather than the bad, I can safely say my answer is mixed. It's all well and good hoping for everyone to be positive, but when you're that person that is feeling such despair, such misery, it seems infuriating. We want people to be open about depression, but as soon as they open up, we want them to close up again. I fear that focusing on what we have and not listening to what people say about the bad, we run the risk of having less and less empathy for one another. We will be putting far too much pressure on people to cope with very bad things, all because we cannot stand someone from being exasperated or melancholic. There's a reason we talk about a glass half empty or glass half full. It's because they go together to make a whole. We need that balance, as does everything in the world. You're listening to VORW International.